For a newcomer, getting into the Pokemon competitive battling scene can be quite confusing to say the least. It may seem as though the entire phenomenon of the Pokemon metagame is filled with weird acronyms, conflicting advice, and general confusion around the basics of building a team. So in an effort to try and help out any prospective competitive battlers, I've decided to make a series of videos where I'll endeavour to explain how to navigate your way through the competitive scene for a newcomer. Personally, I'm not a great competitive battler myself, as I'm sure anyone who's battled me will know, but for the purposes of these videos that doesn't really matter, seeing as I'm making these videos not about advice, tactics and how to win matches. These are more like tutorials designed to give you all the information you'll need to begin your competitive battling journey. And in today's video we're going to be focusing on arguably the most important aspect of competitive battling, which is building a battle-ready team of 6 Pokemon. Also, I'm going to be covering 4 main points in this video, being stat explanation, natures, IVs and EVs. So if you're already familiar with the particular facet of battling I'm explaining, there will be timestamps in the description so you can skip ahead to whatever part of the tutorial you specifically want to hear. At this point, I should probably say that we won't be covering any tier systems, different formats, held items, good movesets, or getting the right ability for your Pokemon. Those are subjects to be explained in detail in their own videos in the future. So with that little preamble out of the way, I'll begin to explain how to build a competitive team. Alright, so to start us off, I'm gonna assume you're familiar with the basic details of Pokemon battling. As in, you know how type matchups work, you know about physical and special moves, you know how different stats affect the power of different moves, and how different species of Pokemon have different stat yields. If you're not entirely sure what I just talked about, I would recommend doing some research about the basic mechanics of Pokemon battles before watching the rest of this video. But if you know what I'm talking about thus far, then we can begin to explore sides of battling that most casual players won't be familiar with. Anyone who's played through a Pokemon game knows that the most important aspect of any Pokemon when it comes to battle is their stats. There are 6 unique stats in total that can be viewed at any time by checking your Pokemon party and viewing the summary information of each Pokemon. You will also see this information when your Pokemon levels up, where the game will give you a nice little display showing the gains and increases to its various stats. And different Pokemon have different stats. Take my Hydreigon for example. It's level 100 and it has a special attack stat of 349. But if we look over at my Scizor, we see that even though it's the same level as my Hydreigon, its special attack stat is much lower at only 131. That's because every Pokemon of a particular species always has particular stat advantages and disadvantages. Take Gyarados here for example. This little graph here displays how each of a Gyarados' stats will fall in relation to each other, before adding any of the 3 main stat modifiers that a trainer has at their disposal, being natures, effort values and individual values, but we'll focus on those modifiers later. For now, let's just leave any thoughts of those aside and focus on the stats displayed on the screen. See how Gyarados naturally has a stronger attack than special attack, and a stronger special defense than physical defense? Well, that's because every single Pokemon naturally has advantages and disadvantages to their stat pool, and these attributes are locked in for every single Pokemon of that species. And by that, what I mean is that these advantages and disadvantages affect every single member of that species equally. So it is literally impossible to get a Gyarados with a higher special attack than physical. To summarize what I've said so far, before you get ready to prepare a particular Pokemon for competitive battling, remember that Pokemon of different species have completely different stat spreads. So if you want a Gyarados to have an amazing special attack stat, I'm sorry, but all the training in the world will never make that Gyarados' special attack nearly as significant as its regular attack stat. And for the most part, you can't manipulate these ratios however you like, which brings us to the next part of our tutorial. The nature. Nature is the single most important factor in preparing a Pokemon for competitive battling. Every Pokemon is automatically given a particular nature upon hatching or being generated in the wild. You can find out what nature your Pokemon has by heading over to their summary screen. And it may seem like this is just an adjective of little significance, but what you may not know is that a Pokemon's nature plays a monumental role in how your Pokemon's stats will increase as it levels up, because Pokemon natures apply a 10% increase to a particular stat and a 10% decrease to another. So if a Pokemon has a modest nature for example, it means that particular Pokemon has a 10% boost to their special attack and a 10% decrease to their regular attack. And if it has a jolly nature, it means that its speed has been increased while its special attack has been decreased. And there are 25 natures in total, each one corresponding to both the stat increase and decrease. This makes a massive difference in competitive battling. Like I said earlier, stats are the most important aspect of any Pokemon battle, and having a perfect nature for the role your Pokemon plays in your team is essential. Honestly, a Pokemon battle can be won or lost on the difference between just one stat point, so having a massive bonus granted by nature is the bedrock of any competitively built Pokemon. There's a nature to correspond to an increase and decrease in every stat, except for HP that is. For some reason natures don't affect HP. If you're having trouble figuring out which natures do what, you can find a helpful chart that details natures and their effects on Bulbapedia, for which a link will be in the description. Which nature is best for your Pokemon depends entirely on their species and the role they're going to fill in your team. For example, I want my Greninja to outspeed my opponents and hit them hard with special attacks, and Greninja doesn't really have great defensive capabilities to begin with, so for the role I want him to fulfill, the Modest nature is perfect as it gives me a great boost to his special attack, and the decrease to his physical attack isn't noticed because my Greninja doesn't have any physically attacking moves. But if you wanted to prioritize speed over special attack, a Timid nature would be great too, as it would increase his speed and decrease his physical attack. But if you take a look at my Toxapex on the other hand, it's designed to use Toxic on the opponent and then stall with Baneful Bunker while setting up toxic spikes, so a Modest or Timid nature would be disastrous on him. But the Bold nature is perfect, as it increases his already amazing defense stat and decreases his relatively unused attack stat. So yeah, no one nature is better than the other. It depends entirely on what Pokemon you have and what you wanted to do in your team. But now that I've explained what nature does, I should mention that natures cannot be changed under any circumstances. Seriously, I cannot stress this enough. Natures are permanent, and the increase and decrease they apply to their respective stats cannot be counteracted or offset with any other method. Having the right nature is the only part of creating a competitive Pokemon that needs to be perfect without fail. I know I might be hitting you guys over the head with this point, but it's super important. So if you take even just one thing away from this video, it's that nature cannot be changed. So sadly, if your Pokemon doesn't have a perfect nature, it will never be a good idea to use it in competitive battling. This means that sadly, if you planned on using some Pokemon you caught in the wild in a playthrough of a regular Pokemon main series game in your competitive team, there's only approximately a 4 to 8% chance that it will have the right nature for its role, so unfortunately you will almost certainly be unable to use your current playthrough team in competitive battles. But if you're still with me up to this point, and you have your desired Pokemon with its perfect nature, we can move on to the second modifier when it comes to a Pokemon stats, and that is a Pokemon's individual values, or IVs for short. This part is a little complex, seeing as IVs are never really explained to the player in the game. In fact, the average Pokemon player who just does a casual run-through of a game probably won't even know what IVs are. Okay, so the premise of IVs is kind of hard to explain, but I'll do my best. IVs are kind of like a Pokemon's natural inborn talent in any particular stat. So as I said, every Pokemon has 6 stats, and when an individual Pokemon is created either by being generated in the wild or by being bred by the player, the Pokemon will be assigned a number between 0 and 31 for each stat. And the idea behind this is that by the time that Pokemon reaches level 100, whatever particular number it was assigned per stat will be added to the base stats it has already acquired. To put it simply, every Pokemon is created to have a natural predisposed boost in particular stats when compared to other Pokemon, and these boosts range from the values of 0 to 31 total stat points. So let's say you have 2 level 100 Tyranitar's. A Tyranitar with the worst possible IV in HP would have a HP stat of 310, but if the other level 100 Tyranitar had the best possible IV in HP, it would have a HP stat of 341. This is because IVs range from 0 to 31 in each stat, so in this case, because the second Tyranitar had a 31 IV in HP, and the first one had a 0 IV in HP, upon both Pokemon reaching level 100, there would be exactly a 31 point difference between the HP stat of the two Pokemon. You'll hear a lot of the time people referring to their Pokemon as having 5 IVs or 6 IVs. This is really just kind of a shorthand way of saying that they have 5 maximized IVs or 6 maximized IVs, which can be a little bit confusing. So if you hear somebody say a Pokemon has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 IVs, they're basically just saying they have that number of perfect, meaning 31 in value, individual values. Now the average Pokemon is very unlikely to have maxed out IVs in every stat naturally, but it is technically possible. It's also equally unlikely to have the worst possible IVs for every stat, and so for the most part the average Pokemon you catch or breed will have a relatively average set of IVs. I know this can be a little convoluted, so let me show you. Once you've hatched over 20 eggs in your Gen 7 game, you can talk to the man standing next to the PC in the battle tree, and he will give you a handy function that allows you to check the IVs of the Pokemon in your PC. To do this, you simply hover your cursor over whatever Pokemon you want to inspect and press the Judge button. This will bring up a handy little graph that will show you what your Pokemon's IVs are, with the center point of the graph representing a value of 0 and the outermost point of each stat representing the max value of 31. And the blue shape on top of that graph shows you where each of your Pokemon's IVs land on this scale between 0 and 31. So take a look at this Inkay. It was caught in the wild, and as you can see it has a fairly average IV yield. On the other hand, take a look at my Flygon. I caught this Flygon as a Trapinch back in Pokemon Sun using the SOS hunting method. However, I was delighted as not only did I get a shiny, but I actually got a Trapinch with a great nature, Adamant, which is exactly the nature I was hoping for. The SOS training method doesn't actually just increase your odds of getting a shiny, but once you go past a certain number of SOS Pokemon called in by the original Pokemon you encountered, the odds of actually getting a Pokemon with great IVs go up to the point where you're actually guaranteed to get a certain number of perfect IVs. And you can see that here. Now it may look like my Flygon has 6 IVs, but as you'll notice, although 4 of them say best, meaning a max value of 31, 2 of them say hyper trained. And this is because they have been artificially boosted after the Pokemon was caught to their maximum value. But we'll cover that in just a minute. Honestly, when I first found out about individual values and what they were, I thought the guy who explained them to me was trolling, seeing as it's such an oddly specific and also unmentioned game mechanic, so I'm aware that this can be a very confusing topic. So if you need to, feel free to rewind back in the video and listen through my explanation a few times. And I know I'm not exactly the best explainer in the world, so if I'm not really making much sense to you, then I've left a link in the description to a handy written guide to IVs on the Pokemon Wiki. But if you're still with me up until now and you have a rough grasp of what IVs are and what they do, then you're probably wondering, can such things be changed or manipulated so your desired battling Pokemon can have its 6 IVs maxed out? And thankfully, since Pokemon Sun and Moon were released, players can now change the IVs of their Pokemon through a process called hyper training. Side note, hyper training is not to be confused with super training. They are two very different things. So basically, prior to Gen 7, IVs could not be changed on any Pokemon whatsoever. They were as concrete and unchangeable as nature's are. But Pokemon Sun and Pokemon Moon introduced hyper training, a mechanic that allows trainers to artificially boost their Pokemon's IVs to the maximum value. At this point, I should probably mention that when it comes to Pokemon breeding, a newly hatched Pokemon can be made to inherit some of its parents' IVs, but the hatched Pokemon will only inherit the parent Pokemon's original IVs, so a hyper-trained Pokemon will perform just as well as a naturally IV maxed out Pokemon, it just won't be able to transfer its artificially boosted IVs down to its offspring. To begin hyper training, you will need your desired Pokemon to be at level 100. Then you will need to take that Pokemon to the shopping centre in Hau'oli City on Melee Island, where a bald man in a red shirt will offer to maximise your Pokemon's IVs in exchange for battle caps. And yes, I realise how ridiculous this sounds, but it's true. Bring a level 100 Mon to this guy and he will maximise 1 IV in exchange for 1 battle cap. Or if you happen to have a gold battle cap, he'll maximise all 6. There is a way in which you can breed your Pokemon to naturally have good IVs, but that can take days per Pokemon, and it's a topic that I'll cover in a future separate video along with a detailed tutorial on the best way to acquire battle caps. So with the basic gist of IVs explained, we are finally ready to move on to the last game mechanic that modifies your Pokemon stat spread. EVs. And no, not those EVs, but EVs, effort values. As I said, you can think of IVs as a Pokemon's inborn natural ability for battle, and EVs are the complete opposite. They are the stat boosts a Pokemon gains from defeating specific Pokemon in battle. This one is a little tricky for newcomers because the game doesn't really explain to you what EVs are. But similar to IVs, they are more or less an unspoken mechanic that plays a huge role in how your Pokemon's total stats will turn out. So to start us off on explaining what effort values are and how they affect your Pokemon, you need to understand that defeating Pokemon either in the wild or against other trainers doesn't just give your battling Pokemon experience points towards leveling up. Every single Pokemon species in existence is assigned a particular stat that corresponds to what's known as its effort value yield. And when a Pokemon of this species is defeated, the Pokemon that defeated it is actually gaining an effort value to correspond to the Pokemon it knocked out. So for example, a Bidoof has an EV yield of 1 HP, meaning that whenever a Bidoof is defeated, the Pokemon that battled it, including the Pokemon who got EXP from the EXP share, will actually gain 1 HP effort value. This effort value that your battling Pokemon received ends up going towards one of the 510 individual effort values that any Pokemon can hold at one time. Now this is important because for every 4 effort values of a particular stat your Pokemon gets, its own corresponding base stat will be increased by 1 by the time it reaches level 100. For instance, take a look at this newly hatched Poplio. This particular Poplio has never been in any kind of battle. It is essentially a blank slate, and it, like every other Pokemon, can hold a maximum of 510 effort value points. So, let's say I have a level 100 Mew who has no effort values and has a HP stat of 100. If this Mew defeats 4 Bidoofs, in turn receiving 4 HP effort values, its base HP will increase by a single point, bringing it up to 101 HP. This works across all stats. Pidgey has an EV yield of 1 speed, and so, like all stats, by defeating a Pidgey, your battling Pokemon and any other Pokemon connected via the experience share will receive 1 speed EV. And of course, like all stats, 4 speed EVs will correspond to a single base stat total increase of 1 speed to the particular Pokemon once it has reached level 100. It's important to remember that a Pokemon can only hold 510 of these effort values at one time, and each stat can only hold a maximum of 252 effort values at one time, which means unfortunately you can't pack all 510 EVs into just one stat. But what most people do is use the vast majority of their Pokemon's EV capabilities to maximize 2 stats, and use the remaining 4 EV points to add a single point increase to another less important stat. A Pokemon's EV spread can be viewed by pressing Y on your Pokemon summary screen, which will bring up a graph similar to the IV spread graph, except in this case the outermost point of each stat represents a possible maximum of 252, but the center point still represents 0. So now, in comparison to my Poplio, let's take a look at my Ninetales. This is a Ninetales I used on a regular old playthrough of Pokemon X, so seeing as I just used it to battle my way through the main game, it has a fairly even spread of EVs. But if you are going to be battling competitively, you need to think very carefully about the best way to use these EVs. So now, let's look at the Scizor I bred for my competitive doubles team. As you can see, I've trained my Scizor so that all of its EVs go into maximizing its attack and speed, but seeing as a single stat can only hold 252 EVs, it means that I had 4 left over, so I put those into defense. This means that at level 100, my Scizor's attack and speed are getting a 63 point increase to each stat thanks to their EVs. Now if you're wondering just how the fudge you can train your Pokemon so it only gets EVs from Pokemon you want it to, then I recommend doing a little research into EV training, seeing as that's a really complex and arduous process that needs its own video. And until I can manage to upload a tutorial of my own, I would recommend watching the tutorial video from PokeTips Official, for which I will leave a link in the description. And if you're wondering just which Pokemon give which EVs when defeated, all you need to do is head onto any Pokemon website such as Cerebi or Pokemon DB, go onto the Pokédex page of a Pokemon, and scroll down. It will show a little piece of information, usually with a name tag like EV Yield or EV Growth, and it will show the corresponding stat. Also, if you have a Pokemon you want to use competitively that has already maxed out its EV spread, there is a relatively easy way to reset your Pokemon's EVs to 0 in each stat, effectively turning them into a blank slate. And thankfully, this process can be done at any time on any Pokemon of any species or level, and it can be done as many times as the player desires. It's actually very straightforward. There are 6 EV lowering berries within the game, with each berry lowering a Pokemon's EV spread of 10 points in a particular stat upon consumption. So feeding your Pokemon a Pomeg berry will lower its HP EVs by 10, a Kelpsie berry will lower its attack EVs by 10, a Qualot berry will decrease its defense EVs by 10, a Hondu berry will have the same effect on special attack, a Greppa berry will do the same to special defense, and lastly a Tomato berry can be used to lower your Pokemon's speed EVs. Depending on how many EVs you need to reset, you could potentially need hundreds of these berries over the course of your competitive battling career, so using the Poképelago berry farming system is highly effective, as it can potentially yield upwards of 150 berries harvested every 48 hours. It's important to remember that the stat boosts you gain from nature's IVs and EVs only take their full effect when your Pokemon reaches level 100. So if you have a level 1 Dratini with a perfect nature, perfect IVs and maximized EVs, you're still going to have to wait until it's leveled up before you can reap the rewards of all your hard work that you put into that Pokemon. The effect of the nature's EVs and IVs do entirely scale with level, so a handy method will be to think of a Pokemon's level as an indicator of what percentage of your Pokemon's full IV, EV and nature's potential you've extracted. So if you head to the battle spot and find that your Pokemon has been set to level 50, don't worry, every Pokemon you face will also be at this disadvantage, so it makes literally no difference whatsoever. The topics I've covered are relatively complex, and I know I've gone through them quite quickly, so if you have any questions at all about anything I've said, then please leave a comment asking me. I do get a notification every time a comment is received, and I have no real social life, so odds are I'll probably reply to your question within an hour or so. But before this video finishes up, let me show you an example of the difference a good nature, perfect IVs, and well-placed EVs can make in a Pokemon stat total. So on the left here I've got a level 100 Flygon with fairly bad nature, average IVs and no effort values. And on the right we see my Flygon with a perfect nature, hyper trained IVs, and my EVs used to max out its attack and speed with the one remaining point going into defense. As you can see, the difference is pretty huge, with a plus 17 in HP for our carefully trained Flygon. Even though we do have a -4 in special attack, our Flygon is a physical attacker. It literally doesn't have any special attacking moves, so there was no point in putting any effort into the special attack stat. Then we have a massive 114 increase in the attack stat, an 11-point increase in special defense, 28 points in defense, and 69 points in speed. As I said, in the competitive battle scene, a battle can be decided by as little as one stat point, so if you want to be the very best like no one ever was, you're going to have to use all of these methods to your advantage if you hope to win battles. Keep in mind that people take competitive battling extremely seriously. I'm not a great battler myself, so I can't offer the best strategic advice, but you can bet that every trainer you come up against in a tournament is going to have perfect natures, perfect IVs, and perfect EVs. So if you want to go toe to toe with Pokemon heavyweights, you really have no choice but to use these methods. So with that, I will finish up. I know I'm not exactly brilliant at explaining things clearly, so I'm sorry if any of what I said seemed a little unclear. Hopefully, if I've done my job right, I've explained the rough outline of how a competitive Pokemon is built, what IVs, EVs, and natures are, and their importance in the competitive battling scene. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, then you could consider subscribing. I livestream every day and I try to drop a video like this or a top 10 every few weeks, so we'd love to have more people in our little community. The channel is still new, so I'm kind of finding my feet on YouTube, but if you want to help out, a subscription or a like would mean the world to me. So with that, I thank you for watching and I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day.